Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Historical Snapshots Conversations. Our guest today is Alexis Coe, and Alexis and I are going to chat about George Washington. There are many conversations we can have about him, but our focus today will be on Washington becoming president. A little about Alexis before we start. She's a presidential historian, American history columnist at the New York Times, senior fellow at New America, and New York Times bestselling author of almost 3 books, including You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington. Alexis, welcome. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So to get started with some context, what is the state of America at the time?
Oh, I'd rather answer that than the state of America right now. Thank you for that softball. And actually, a different question. I don't usually get that. George Washington, from his perspective, he has retired and he is watching America from afar, from Mount Vernon, and he's very concerned. He is done in his mind with public service. The revolution, it boggles the mind. They still think it happened really quickly, or at least took a few years. It took 8 long years. And in that time, Washington's beloved Mount Vernon, his forced labor camp, what we would call a plantation if we're being sort of more Southern about it, it had fallen into disrepair. Martha Washington, who had never been happy out of the state of Virginia, first colony, then the state, was so happy to be back. They both declared that they would never leave again, maybe for a wedding, probably not. And they are content, but also sort of harassed by Americans, by visitors from abroad, because there is no one more famous in the country, but in the world at this point than George Washington. He has done the unthinkable. He has come. I always like to point this out. He's not only, and I start my book this way, he's the son of a single mother and the grandson of an indentured servant. It's an amazing American tale that I wish we focused on more. But he's had this incredible story, even if you don't know that. He's defeated one of the greatest empires with nothing but a ragtag army, and he himself had limited and problematic, shall we say, military experience. So he's fielding a lot of visitors. He's using his celebrity the way he wants to, which is not to be president or, the equivalent of getting your own show at that time. He is just making repairs and once in a while using his influence to say, get the Spanish king to send him a donkey because he really wants to breed. And he thinks that's the future of American agrarian society. He has Thomas Jefferson put in a good word because they're friends. That will change when he becomes president. That's his idea of the life. But he's at the same time looking from afar at how the country is functioning under the articles of, I call situationships, but it is the articles of, it is not a strong document that tethers the colonies. And the colonies were not tethered to begin with by design. The British didn't want the colonies to talk. They didn't want them to trade directly. They didn't want any of that because, oh no, rebellion happened. Spoiler, happened anyway. But they literally had their own currency. And so we have these disparate entities who are suddenly a country. And there are problems that we know exist now, that we know came to a head during the Civil War, that existed from the very beginning between the North and the South, because the South had paid off their debts according to them, and we know how they did it. There's a good line from Hamilton, we know how you did it, slave labor. And then the North has not. And the problem is the British are messing with Americans because they expect to be paid. That's how wars work. That's how divorce works. You have to settle up somehow. And so they are, taking over certain areas. They're being violent. Things are happening. There's lots of territories being grabbed. And Washington is writing to people like John Jay and others, and he's saying, this is a disaster. I gave up so much for this. We all did. And it's all going to be for naught. And then, and I'm going to pause because I feel like I haven't let you get in a word, but then they say, okay, well, we're going to get together, have a little party, a little bit like before we signed the Declaration of Independence, which he didn't because he was already on his way. And he had, he hadn't been a general for such a long time. I always joke that he sort of got a like generaling for dummies book as he left. He stopped at a bookstore. Like he was me in a nutshell. Like, oh my God, I don't know anything about this. Let me buy 15 books. And then he'll meet back up with them. Martha refuses to come, but he gives in really reluctantly, and he thinks it's his last hurrah with these dudes.
It sounds like there's a great conversation to be had about George Washington, the general.
Yes. Yes, but he's upset, and they're all making sure that he stays that way. And they have a long-term, it's like a long con that he doesn't realize yet. They get him to go to the Constitutional Convention this way, and then they get him to do something else.
So before we get there, it sounds like, understand kind of the mood of Washington at the time, maybe some of the politicians and some of the state of affairs at the time. What is the mood of the people like?
The people are still really focused on Washington as, again, being this unifying figure, America's first celebrity. There's still loyalists. There are still people who believe that they should be loyal to the crown. Many of those loyalists had a rough time during the war. The Hessian soldiers were well known for their brutality. There were rapes, there were murders, there was the stealing of food and livestock, and there is uncertainty. But they're trying between neighbors at the same time. But they're all trying to find this sort of identity. Washington calls them the infant nation. And I always think of, we call people the mother of their country, this and that. I always think of Washington actually carrying America to term. And then he's like, okay, best of luck, but you can't really leave a baby. You can't just abandon a baby. And so I think of it that way. But they're getting used to life in America, but it's not settling quite as it should.
And before we jump in to talk about Washington becoming president, what does the role of president mean at the time, or how are the politicians thinking about this before Washington becomes the president?
So another good question. They are thinking about the presidency more in the Articles of Confederation. So they're thinking of it more as there is an executive, there's some balance of powers, but not the branches as we know them. The president's powers are still ill-defined. What everyone knows they don't want is a king. They know they don't want a despot. They know they don't want a dictator. And that's a rough spot to be in during that time. Because if you look around the world, that's basically what's going on. There are kings, there are starting to be other revolutions. America birthed an age of revolutions. We inspired it. They were all far bloodier. And this is a key thing. So we talked about violence on the, I always say that it's, it is like a situationship in that it's like, it's union on the parchment sheets, but it is absolute chaos in the streets. And they're in this like structure that is designed to fail. It's not them. It's not that they're too much. It's that they need to be governed in a way that makes sense from the presidency down. And that's not happening in America's early years.
Okay. So then how does Washington become president, and why him? What makes him the right person for the job, if you agree he was the right person for the job? If that statement is a fair statement.
He would groan at that. I think, famously quiet and a little taciturn because, of course, he had, by the time he was inaugurated, he would have a tooth left, a tooth. And the rest of them were dentures. And some of it was, bad hygiene, poor hygiene, early dentistry. Some of it was just not taking care of his teeth as he should have, or he realized a little too late. His dentist once accused him of drinking too much port, which was not his drink. So they were not friends. We know that. He liked Madeira, as they all did. All the founders did. Jefferson he liked wine quite a bit. But he also cared for Madeira above all else. But that wasn't your question. Your question was, how did he become president? How did he feel about it? So he goes to the Constitutional Convention and he thinks he's just there to keep the peace because he is this figure that has been incredibly significant in the country and the world. And he doesn't have to do much. He goes, he sits on a platform, he sits in this big chair, and when people get a little too rowdy, he jumps up and clears his throat. He does something, but he's not really making major contributions. It's not so much what he's doing from, the bully pulpit, from the in this earliest iteration from the dais. It's what they are seeing. So there's obviously quite a bit to figure out, and a lot of it doesn't totally make sense. Like, we have age requirements, for example. I'm going to go on an aside here. It's very meaningful to me. And the aside is that an example of something that didn't work out. There was should they have age, not a ceiling, because they figured everyone dies pretty young. Washington and the men in his family, he outlived them all. The women lived a little bit older, but he lived quite a bit longer than I think any man in his family. But the rest are not really worried about aging out of anything. They are, however, worried about who will run. They don't want some 18-year-old. They want someone who has had experience, specifically discussed the kind of experience they would like is in Congress, is in government. And so they just assume that, college is not a regular. Washington is the only founder among the first presidents who didn't go to college. He was too poor, go back to the single mother. And so then what he's obviously not going to go through this school. But they think, okay, that gives lots of time. And there's this back and forth. You need 35 trips around the sun. But one of the greatest advocates for that then ends up not signing. He gets that through and he doesn't sign the Constitution because he doesn't like that slavery is baked in. Which is, so ironies already abound. There's lots of contradictions. But what they do know is worked out. What they do know they don't have to worry a lot about is the presidency. They have figured out next to nothing about it. If you read the Constitution, it's awfully light, unfortunately, as we know now, on the presidency. But they don't have too much figured out. And I love, there's a copy of Washington's annotated Constitution, and he just sort of marks off a few places. It's the most lightly annotated thing ever, because it's only about 7 places, and he's like, president, okay, sure. And that's it. But he doesn't think he's going to be president, and he is the only one who leaves the Constitutional Conventions with that impression. Everyone else is like, great, he came, he saw, he's gonna president. And they all go on this kind of campaign to get him to do so. So they write letters. John J. Hamilton, they say, dude, you showed up. You that was essentially a binding commitment. And because another person he will not speak to anymore, James Madison, lives nearby, that guy is just stopping by all the time, bothering him. He is showing up at Christmas. He's a single man. He doesn't marry Dolly Madison. She's 26. He's 17 years older. So he's rolling solo. And that's actually thanks to Martha Washington. So he has this kind of, flexibility, whereas the rest have families. Everyone is just pressuring him. And he's like, well, I guess if, when your life belongs to Rome, et cetera, et cetera. So he's quoting a bunch of great philosophers. And he accepts the unanimous nomination and election, but he writes about going to his inauguration, which, by the way, the man would die one of the wealthiest landowners in America, but had to borrow money to get there. He writes that process was like going to his execution. He had everything to lose, and he was right.
And from your perspective, why do you think he was such a unanimous choice from all the people involved in the decision making? What was it about him that everyone was like, it has to be Washington?
Absolutely. And it's a really good question. I think one we misunderstand fundamentally about Washington. When we say, oh, he was unanimously elected, oh, he was the general for 8 years. The British, by the way, swapped out every year, and that was a big part of Washington's success. He benefited from circumstances as well. You always want continuity, you want stability. Who doesn't? You need it even if you have the greatest naval fleet in the world. So he is he's revered, he's respected. I've talked about that, but he's not lauded as a perfect, charming human. It's not a sort of devil or angel kind of dichotomy that we have now. The understanding is that so to go back even further, let's go back to Valley Forge, right? During Trump's inauguration, a religious leader gave a speech and he said, Washington kneeled at Valley Forge. No, he wouldn't have fundamentally, because he was a deist. So that means that he believed that God was sort of a set it and forget it kind of thing. He did not believe there would be any intervention. So why would God bother listening to him? Also, that painting that was referenced and that we so famously can see in our heads, that was painted many, many, many decades after. So the sort of attempt to make Christian nationalism a part of our founding identity has been around for a very long time. But what's interesting about Valley Forge is it was awful, right? It was an awful first winter during the war, and awful in every respect, right? It's cold. Many of the troops don't have shoes. They're not trained. They're going up against professional armies. And these are people who are volunteering, which Washington hates. He's like, you need to pay people or else they're not going to work hard for you. And he knows this because he has had his fortunes changed many times, but certain people don't. Certain members of, let's say, the Addams family don't. And he is also facing a lot of challenges from within. So there are other generals who want to be the general. They want to be the general of this great army. They're asking for things in exchange, like, hey, if I'm caught, because if you the British were not calling it a revolution, they were calling it a rebellion so that they could squash it. They wouldn't have to follow the rules of war. And also they could seize a lot of property. And so a lot of the people who were up for the job before they signed the Declaration of Independence were like, okay, but can you prepay me for my house? Can you promise to take? And they're like, no, that's not how it works. You're giving yourself to a cause. It's not like, there's no insurance policy here. Washington is fine with that because he's got Martha money, and he's fine. So he is, but at the same time, Congress, everyone's vying for his position, and there's so much criticism of him during that first winter from inside. So Congress sends a emissary, basically, of different members, different delegates who describe it as like, we're going to go there and we're going to mess him up. We're going to read him the Riot Act. They're pretty serious about it. And they get there and they realize, I don't like what he's doing. I don't like the way he's talking about it. I don't like a lot of things, but he's doing the best job anyone could possibly do. And he's doing it under a tremendous amount of pressure and with absolutely no ego. And he will get that over time, but at first, and he was 42 when it started, which is mind-boggling to think about. But he is this figure who can get it done. That under intense circumstances, he's not going to Benedict Arnold. He's not going to become embittered in a hospital. He's not going to be traitorous. He's not going to be looking to line his own pockets. Not through this, at least. Land, sure, always. He's always hungry for land, but he's not. He's going to be as up and up as one can be by their standards, not by ours. So, for example, when he's president, he will rotate enslaved people out of the president's house in Philadelphia because if he let them stay for more than 6 months, the people he brought because he didn't want to pay employees, he was renting the house from Robert Morris. He didn't want to pay them. And so he brought everyone who he, liked and who knew what he liked from Mount Vernon. But they, of course, learned, even though he was like, let's just keep it quiet. No one will find out that if you walk outside, you will be free. They, so he would have these very open conversations with his secretary, with other people with Randolph, a member of his cabinet, about rotating enslaved people. So breaking the law. So, there was always a lot going on in this office, even before the office physically existed. I always say that, when I go on TV and I say, there's no precedent for this, there's no precedent for this, I've stopped just saying that and I've said, well, there is somewhat of a precedent for this, but we haven't reckoned with it. And without accountability, it will simply get worse and worse over time. But back to the original question, which was, how does everyone view him? As the best option, as a unifying figure who can handle it. And what they want is someone they can trust. And after the war ended, Washington gave up power. And that was not unheard of. Some of my colleagues like to say, oh, it never happened. That's not true. It had happened, of course. But he did it in a really, can we say wonderful manner? He was desperate for it. He wanted to leave. He kept writing Jefferson, who was procrastinating. Give me directions. I want to be home for Christmas. I don't want to be a part of this anymore. It sucks. And so he is basically, he has presented himself as someone who you can trust and someone who could set up an office. And that's what this is. They're figuring out, how do you receive people? Literally, how do you stand? How do you sit? When do you have drinks? When do you have, what does this look like in America? What does diplomacy look like? What is a cabinet? You're not supposed to have a council. Washington, like a council of war, he had to sort of figure out how to sidestep the Constitution in order to have that. So there's a lot going in that people are like, okay, he's going to be good at setting up this shop, and whatever he does, everyone else will follow. So we haven't figured out that much. We can trust him. And then, of course, he gets to the presidency. There's only one man I know, by the way. I say man because they've all been men so far. There's only one man I know who is not, when he found out he was elected, uttered something like, if I may, oh shit. Lincoln to Obama, Washington included, everyone has said, oh, dear God, except for our current president, with very good reason. Even if you like that job, it is very unpleasant, demanding. And for Washington, again, he felt like he had everything to lose. And spoiler, he was right.
And so just on that note then, so, you said earlier that, sorry if I misquote you, but he felt as if he was going on his way to his execution.
Yeah.
On one hand, then I get the process of picking a president was different then, but he is unanimously wanted by those who are, which couldn't theoretically be a better situation.
Sure.
And what is he worried about as he's on his way to becoming president, or he learns he's going to be the president?
A few things. Well, from a personal point of view, so Washington, people like to say that he, the father of our country was no father. And I talk about this in the introduction to You Never Forget Your First. That I think that's the only explanation I can really fathom about why his previous biographers go on and on about his masculine manliness. Because as far as I know, nobody's questioning it. No one has ever questioned it. It's of all the things you're going to wonder about George Washington, it's not like, was he manly enough? He certainly was. But and in early America, it's also anachronistic, and it's not really true to the time period and the impressions they had at the time, because biological connections are something we're obsessed with, but they were not. I can name many presidents who are raising children as their own who are not. You have James Madison. You have just a ton of them, and they. In early America, if you married a woman who had a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, which is what Martha Washington had when she met Washington, couldn't be a better situation. You have 2 young kids you get to raise on your own. The person you're with has proven that they can have children. And, maybe you'll have more, maybe you won't. Who cares? Like, it's a dangerous business. So if you like your wife and you want to sort of keep the family together, then you're just going to say thank you and move on. But those children have died. And one of the saddest moments in the many years I've spent with him and during my research was his letter after Patsy died. You see these guys on their best days and their worst days. People always ask how I feel about him, and I think, oh, I couldn't possibly. It's also professional, but I you have to be horrified at the way that he keeps his ledgers on enslaved people. You have to be horrified when you later read from a living Ladies of Mount Vernon, who is the fundraising arm of Mount Vernon, his historic home, that ledger is like a biography that he insisted on keeping for each enslaved person. And you're like, I think biographies have more than a first name, an estimated age, a price, a specialty. It's not quite true. And then you have to really feel for him when he writes something that's really moving about a death. And he feels it. And he is also really determined to be a good father. So that's with Patsy. She dies young. And then Jackie, who Tudor had written, was born to be an Asiatic prince, was like just a ne'er-do-well, which really sort of summarizes almost all the male heirs of presidents. We have a couple exceptions. There's John Quincy Adams, of course, as the earliest, and probably the most recent was Beau Biden, and not a lot between or after. You have those guys, and that's it. Jackie died at Yorktown, which makes it sound like he was in the war. He was not. He was there for a month, and then he died. And he died from can't feed. I don't mean to chuckle, but he was an awful person, so it's fine. And then so he's now raising Jackie's kids. And Martha wants nothing more but to raise them in Virginia. She hates leaving Virginia. Now she has to be first lady. That was not, as she will later write, the deal they had early in their marriage. And she feels like the role is better, which we didn't call first lady then, was better suited for a younger woman. So you have an unhappy family. You have a ton of, he's going to have to again suspend his many projects, like 17-sided barns and things at Mount Vernon. He's going to, most of all, and as he's going to, what he calls his execution, it's not like it's a bad ride. He's being celebrated everywhere he stops, and there are big parades and people greeting him at various places. But he knows that that's not going to last, and that he will be blamed kind of for everything, and that there's so much that's out of his control, and he is a control freak. So the sort of drama happens before he gets there. And this is how the vice presidency became the vice presidency. John Adams, they're trying to figure out a title. They still haven't figured that out. The Constitution has been written. Washington is making his way there. John Adams is already in New York, the first seat of power, before they moved to Philadelphia as a compromise for Foggy Bottom, which is, of course, Washington, D.C. And he is he's suggesting all these crazy long titles. That's like His Royal Majesty of something, something, something. And they're like, well, no, we fought a whole war over that. We're not going to do that. And Washington, when he hears, is so mortified that he's like, that guy's done. I don't want him with me. And then Adams, who has been really active during the war in his own way, he's been fundraising, he's been abroad. He's obviously, we remember him as a prolific thinker and writer, and Abigail Adams is wonderful for spilling the tea as well. They are shoved to the side almost immediately, which is incredibly frustrating to them. So Washington is aware that he will basically be criticized nonstop. But he has no idea. It's going to be so much worse than that. And that is why he is not happy about going to that inauguration.
And so it seems like the politicians are excited to have him. The people are excited to have him. He's not excited, to say the least, but he becomes president. What are the expectations of him at that time?
Establish the office, not just how you receive people. Everything is, we should have some boats We should have treaties. He had set America up. He followed the rules for, and he made that really well known that he was starting a country, and that country was going to be stable. And as a result, again, we had this age of revolutions that were so bloody. You have the French Revolution is the one that everyone knows of. This, and nothing like that was happening in America. And it was because he sort of set up law and order, as Republicans would call it today, early on. And so he's expected to do that. Should we have a standing army? Should we not? But the big thing is all these revolutions and also the wars that we started inadvertently. The wars between France and Spain and the English, that they didn't just stop once the American Revolution was over. They were now fighting those wars in every single colonial holding, in addition to all these revolutions. And so there's a lot of goodwill towards America and a lot of not goodwill. So and America is supposed to have France's back, for example, because of a treaty that was signed during the war. We would not have won the revolution without the French. Even Yorktown, which I mentioned earlier, Washington really wanted to go to New York. He did not want to go to Yorktown. And Rochambeau, amazing name for a general, Rochambeau is like, no, we have to go south. It's the key to winning the war. And he was right. Washington lost more battles than he won. I think they did realize that at the time. So it's not like they knew he was, he wasn't perfect, but even by their standards, but they figured he would figure it out. But so then sort of the big issue is, should America come to France's aid because that's who came to ours? But as Washington points out, so everyone's fighting about this. And even actually, though, even Thomas Jefferson, who is famously a Francophile, sort of stood back and said, well, why don't we basically let them bid on us and see who will give us the best deal for either remaining neutral or helping them? Washington's like, oh, I don't think so. But I don't think we should do anything. And so he issues a proclamation of neutrality. And this is also impacting American ships. They're being seized left and right. So it is a matter that needs to get resolved very quickly. In addition to, and of course the French are mad about this, but his point, this is a savage George Washington here. His point was that the people they signed the treaty with are dead. Their heads have been cut off. This is an entirely new government. This has nothing to do with us. Do with that what you will. Another thing he needs to do is he needs to sign many treaties with Indigenous people, because there's a lot of trouble between settlers and Native Americans, and certainly different colonial superpowers are encouraging those difficulties. So Washington, this is how sort of the cabinet is born. He walks into Congress with a treaty. He needs to, sort of a bunch of questions that he sent ahead of time. He needs to sign a treaty with the Creeks. Is one of the first things that needs to happen. So he goes to Congress and he's like, okay, let's do this. And to his mind, they should be prepared to answer every question that he sent in advance. Mm-hmm. They were not. Some of it was that Congress was just getting started. They didn't really know what was going on. He was very annoyed that they had to close the windows, and then it was too hot, and then they had to open the windows, but there was so much noise on the street with the carriages going by, and all sorts of great little flavor. There's a congressman named McKay who kept a diary of this, and it's very colorful. And in part because McKay is such a fanboy. And he is like, oh my God, it's George Washington. I cannot believe he's here. He's so handsome. He moves so gracefully. They're all just in love with him. John Quincy Adams, when he's at The Hague during the war, he's like a 15-year-old, and he basically has a poster of George Washington on his wall. He's enamored with him. And they all end up naming their children George Washington, including Lafayette. So he walks in and he's like, okay, what are your answers? And they're all hemming and hawing, and they basically resolve to break into more groups to resolve how they will resolve the issue. And Washington is like, two middle fingers. and leaves, and he loses his temper. He has a huge temper, but he manages to mask it from most people. And he leaves and he says, I'm done and I'm never coming back. And he didn't. And so then he tried a backup because he's not allowed to have any sort of council because you don't want it to be the Privy Council all over again. Even though they're now fully aware that the king is the problem, that he was the problem, they're still mostly mad at Parliament. And so Washington tries to work within this boundary, and he writes the heads of each department, a Secretary of War, as we called it then. So he's got Jefferson, Hamilton, Randolph, a bunch of other people, and he's got a diverse cabinet. He is the only president who's never declared a political party. He's very concerned about partisanship in his first term and his second, but more in his first term. He writes them, it's taking too long, so he invites them all there. And Hamilton and Jefferson are in every way opposed to each other. It's one thing to fight a war, and this gets to your earlier question. It's one thing to fight a war. It's quite another to try and run a country. You can all get together when there's a common enemy, but when that doesn't exist in the same way, in the same overarching way, and there are just a million fires everywhere, and there's competing visions of America, big government, small government, slavery, no slavery, all these things, it becomes contentious, shall we say. And what really made sense to me, I thought, well, but how could they all have gotten along so well when they were abroad? Ben Franklin, John Adams, all these people who have just different visions, and then have this be such a horrible thing. And I read a description, and that's when it all clicked. Jefferson described the cabinet meetings, which were not every day, as I think some people think. There were probably 8 or 9 in his entire presidency, as cockfights. I have never seen a cockfight live, and I hope I never do. I did watch a clip for the book, and it is a blood sport. It is a razor-beaked fight to the death situation. Jefferson had seen one, and he still described it that way. And that also means that Washington is presiding over this great. Fight it out, and I will make a decision. And he thinks once he makes the decision, everyone will be okay. But they're not. These fights spill onto the streets. And those then make it into partisan newspapers that are written by anonymous contributors named Thomas Jefferson. But they go by, names my favorite is Porcupine. And he was indeed very prickly. And Washington, though, at the same time is oh, no, it's not Jefferson. It's not Madison. It's not Monroe. It's not all these guys. It's fine. Just stop. Just stop, Hamilton. Eventually, he does believe him because it's just absolutely obvious that this is true. But they are talking about him in the streets, and he hates it. And then he also is just not, he's losing friends left and right. And I call them frenemies. I don't think that they were ever really good friends. But he died, he wasn't speaking to the vast majority. The only one he was speaking to was Hamilton, for obvious reasons, and then Adams, because he basically didn't include him in anything. Thomas Paine was a pretty big thorn in his side for a minute because he was in a French prison for revolution hopping, much like the Marquis de Lafayette and other people. And he wrote to Washington, and he thought, oh, yeah, Washington's going to help me. I wrote all those very influential pamphlets, and they helped him during the war, and we were good buddies. And then Washington's I'm sorry, I can't help you. That would be untoward. And Paine goes nuts. He writes an open letter that he wants to send on Washington's birthday, and Madison, who's basically the ambassador, shuts him down. But he does publish it, and it says something future generations will struggle to figure out if you were ever decent or if you were just hiding it the whole time. It is not, oh, you've changed. It's I don't think you were ever good now. And Monroe is recalled by Washington from France. And Monroe writes not the first tell-all, there have already been some, but kind of the one that I love, because it's a moment in which we see Washington lose his temper. And I have no other evidence that I've seen that's as convincing. I've seen accounts of it, they're pretty vague. But in this, he is annotating in the margins from like the first, this is from by Monroe. It's like, well, there was no one else to send. And then it's until the last word. And he's just talking about how incompetent he was. He was very clearly hurt by all of this. And actually, then to skip ahead to the second term and then 2 points, his second term, many of these people have left government or he doesn't talk to them anymore. And his next cabinet, everyone is politically aligned with him. And then the night before he dies, so this has been going on, or 2 nights before, because it's a real struggle. But when he's dying, sort of the last time he's upright in front of a fire, Tobias Lear, his secretary, would marry into the family, marry their favorite niece, was reading aloud from the paper. And Washington got so mad because Jefferson, Madison, Monroe were doing well that he started to like choke because he was already sick. And Martha said, I can't deal with this anymore. And she went to bed. And Lear was like, please, like these people don't matter anymore. It was pretty clear he was going to die. So he really was affected by this and he became embittered, and he's already arthritic and toothless and, old, and he has bad eyesight, and now he's got to deal with this. He's not a fan. And Jefferson, I think, said that he was the most sensitive to criticism he'd ever seen.
Interesting. Would you say, was there a broader significance to these happenings, or was it kind of the expectations of politics?
Oh, interesting. You mean of was he worse than we think kind of thing? Or I think he was, it's hard to rank him alongside any other president, even though we have to do it quite often. Interestingly, we're not doing it this year. The C-SPAN rankings, we're not doing it. They've been called off. And so it's impossible to measure him against other people because he invented the office. At the same time, what we do remember him for is significant. The peaceful transition of power, inventing the office, all sorts of things. I don't agree, however, on the other end of the spectrum when people say, oh, he was a man of his time. So were the men he enslaved. So were lots of other people who realized that was wrong, including Lafayette, who tried to talk him out of it constantly, and even offered to compensate him and to go half-seas on what would basically be tenant farming, so not great either, but really tried to work with him. And so we have, if Washington, he started out trying to do his best in as he would as a military leader, I think, and then was not. He made a lot of mistakes, as one does. Another really big mistake is he sidestepped the Constitution again to squash a rebellion that wasn't happening.
Oh.
So it's called the Whiskey Rebellion. And, kind of a famous phrase during the Revolution, no taxation without representation. Well, whiskey distillers, which he was also one of the largest, I should note, in the country at that point. But whiskey distillers, they, as most people in America, were an agrarian society. But these people who they were trying to tax weren't landowners. So they couldn't have representation because you weren't allowed to vote if you weren't a landowner in America, and white, and a bunch of man and a bunch of other things. Right. So they literally didn't have money to pay, even if it was unfair that they were being asked to do so. Like they didn't have the cash, and they are having some big reactions, not quite as many as Washington thinks, but there's an episode, someone is tar and feathered, not a pleasant experience. But he's writing to Hamilton in New York, who is now, ironically, we do know that he enslaved people as well. He owned people, right? Because he left them in his will. So that's you cannot argue against it, though Ron Chernow has tried. He was the head of the Abolition Society in New York at the same time. He's he's a businessman now. He's going, as we know, the Reynolds affair, a lot going on in his life. But he's still there for Washington. And he basically says, I'll come down, I'll help you out, because when there's a rebellion, you need to show up and you need to make them fear God. And Washington is like, yes, I know how to do that. And so he actually has Jefferson would say it's astonishing. I call it kind of the chutzpah to ride out without checking, are they really having a rebellion? What's going on? The governor's like, please don't do this. Don't come to my state. A little familiar, actually, to the moment. And halfway through, he turns around because he knows it's a bad look. And indeed, if he had ridden all the way, he would have been totally, I don't know if he would have gotten, he would have the same reputation as he has now. Because when Hamilton and an army got to this field where Washington had fought as when he worked, was working for the British for the other team, there was no one there. There was no rebellion. So it was really embarrassing. And it was just like a bad look in general. And then Washington pardoned all of them.
Wow.
Yeah. There was sort of some show trials, but otherwise he had to pardon them. So I think there was definitely, these things were known, but at the same time, all these frenemies and all these critics after the first term wanted him to stay. After the second, would have been fully open to it. He was not. He was like, I am absolutely done, in part because he didn't want to die in office.
Interesting. So how does he shape the office? He's the first president. How does he shape that role?
Well, he shapes it because he does establish certain things like the cabinet, how presidents interact with foreign dignitaries and also Congress, how they manage their days, sort of the process of being president, if that makes sense. It's different now, but then he went on tours, the northern and southern tours, which Martha thought was like pretty unfair. She didn't want to do that, maybe the South, but she also didn't think it was totally fair that he got to leave her, to handle everything on the ground, especially in these heathen northern cities. And, with all their egalitarian and progressiveness. And he is establishing that communication with different branches, how one balances those close to them. Are they politically aligned? Are they not? But he's also doing a lot of hand on his forehead. He is really upset about partisanship. And in his farewell address, which people have, it's funny, if you were to ask me, I started writing this book, I think in 2012, 2014. I thought about other ones, but I kept I need to circle for a long time before, unfortunately, decades before I get there. If you were to ask me, how much will you talk about the farewell address? If and when you publish a book, I would say, not a lot. But I have talked about it constantly, and actually something very cool happened around President's Day. But the things that we talk about a lot, the collective we in American society as commenters and historians, and we talk about his warning about partisanship. This was not an address that he delivered because he was done with Congress, but he wrote it to my friends. And he had it distributed. And, not everyone was literate, but they were able to hear it in different pubs. And he warned against partisanship. And he said it's because what happens is local leaders, they get elected, they become obsessed with power and retaining power, and they will not serve their constituency. They will simply try to maintain power. And then that just clears the way for a despot, is the word that he used. And then there are other warnings about foreign influence. But what's interesting is because of this sort of, that it wasn't a major part of my book. It was, a chapter, but it wasn't a major part of it. I hadn't read drafts in a really long time. And so this year, this President's Day 2025, which is always like a pretty big bender for me, not in a fun way. I mean, it is fun, but I view it and increasingly as kind of the most important assignment of my life. and like, I'm going to win hearts and minds. This one, I was nuts. I wrote something like 8 pieces and was doing nothing but press for a week. But one of the coolest things I did get to do, which I'm really grateful that Slate allowed me to do, was I looked at early drafts. Well, it's because I found something, but I wrote to my editor there and said, I was messing around with early drafts because it's been so long since I read them. And I found these cut lines that speak to this moment. And so I got to write a whole essay on excised lines. And what was amazing about it was that I noticed things, of course, that weren't relevant to me from 2012 until 2020, January 2025, when we saw during the inauguration all of these tech executives there, front and center, and all these just incredibly rich men. And one of the lines, so Washington said, okay, so this is how we could fall into authoritarianism. This is how there could be a coup. This is obviously, if you have the military, everything's done, but military people tend to be disciplined, and in his experience, were aligned with the, as we call the American dream, and the idea of this infant nation becoming a superpower and becoming a great stable force in the world. But he was worried about factionalism. He was worried about foreign powers. He was worried about influence. But the people, I'd never noticed this. The people he was actually very concerned about. He said, there's another group. You haven't even heard of this group. This group wants connections to government, not because they're interested in bettering the country or they fought for it. They didn't fight for it all. Basically, the equivalent of shin splints he went off on. But what they have done is they have money and they've made it. They profited somehow. Maybe it was war profiteering, which a lot of people did. Abigail Adams did. But they have made money in such a manner that they are devoid of patriotic ties. They could be inhabiting the British Empire. They don't care. It just means that their seat at the table is probably better than it would have been. And what they will do is they will trade whatever they can to enrich themselves and keep that seat at the table. They will ingratiate themselves to a despot. They will, to our mind, it's sort of like the USSR, where everything's just being sold off by different oligarchs who still exist and have yachts that are ranked as the largest in the world kind of thing today, that they will basically do that. And that they are the most untrustworthy characters of anyone who he had mentioned. He feared them more than foreign powers, more than partisanship, more than all these things. And then I think he got to the final draft, and Hamilton had also said, you are bitter, and a lot of this reads as such. So we need to make sure that this is aligned with what will wear well. And I think that was too vague a concept for most Americans, and also sounded kind of awesome to them because everyone has always been aspirational, on these shores. That was cut. But for me, that was an incredible find and the most meaningful essay I've written in years, except for actually there was another one, unrelatedly, sort of relatedly. I testified before Congress and I hated it. So then I wrote an essay for MSNBC. But those two define this year for me.
Got it. Interesting. But even though, so he has this final message to the country as president, he creates, or at least let's say he succeeds in creating a lineage that has now lasted nearly 250 years.
Yes, and some of it hasn't. Like the first Fugitive Slave Act, he's responsible for. It actually wasn't later. It was the first one was under him. But yes, some things haven't, but many things have, including, let's say, the peaceful transition of power, which for almost 250 years lasted. And that is something we have taken for granted. And I will say that a lot of his contributions to establishing the office have been taken for granted, but still exist.
And is it fair to ask, like, were there a handful that were just monumental, that these were the things that really were the defining contributions that really did set the country on a trajectory of creating, I'm using success in the sense that lineage of from president to president for 250 years, were there a few contributions that really were directly tied to George Washington that put the country on that path?
Right. So I'm going to answer this, but I have to preface it with a disclaimer, which is that when you chronicle the life of someone like George Washington, who inspires a lot of reactions from people, which I think is interesting, and I think, we can discuss that later. I think a lot of that is manufactured by the media and by conservative politicians. But when you have someone who elicits these kinds of opinions, there's the assumption that I am judging him. And I always say that I study Washington because he's historically significant. If you are interested in making him your hero or your villain, that is a personal choice that you are very welcome to make. But it is not what I am bringing to the table. I am bringing everything that can inform you to make those decisions. And so, if I were to say something like establishing the cabinet, I think is really important. The peaceful transition of power. There are, people who would say, well, he enslaved people, so I don't want to study him at all. Or the cabinet has been a conduit for war crimes, and they will go on about that. There are lots of things. Nothing is clean in the seat of government, and specifically in the executive branch. It has never been that way, and even the presidents you think were, with the exception of like maybe Jimmy Carter, who even had his moments, they've all done shocking things, including including Barack Obama. Everyone has done shocking, awful things and done incredible things. I think that the longevity of many of his contributions, like the cabinet, and the end of many of his negative contributions, like the Fugitive Slave Act, like other things that he, breaking those particular laws, which is, he will not be the first and he's not going to be the last. You have James K. Polk, his wife, who had a desk next to him, is surreptitiously trading enslaved people from the White House, children especially, because of course you can work them really hard and, have them for a bit, whereas you can't really do that with older enslaved people. So you have these awful things that have ended, these good things that have persisted, things that are in the middle. We are, for better or for worse, a global superpower. Washington never, and none of the founders thought that that would be the final say, that anything he did would be the end of our evolution. Jefferson would later write that he had assumed that we would just rewrite the Constitution every 20 years. They, I think, would be pretty shocked to know that we have had so few amendments, so few changes in our country. But I think, and I think Washington would be fairly, he would have some things to say about the current state of affairs. A lot of I told you so's about partisanship. But I think he would, at the same time, if I may, sort of say, it's incredible that some of these things continued, and that while he wouldn't agree with the evolution of certain things like the cabinet or, let's say, women and Black people in power, he would be very excited to see the baton being passed and how it had been passed. But he'd also just be really into like stoplights and things. So I don't, he would be all over the place.
So I guess when you think about his presidency, what word or words come to mind for you?
Foundational, formative, among the obvious candidates, he probably did the best job possible.
Sure.
We can all think, oh, it would have been great if Thomas Paine, couldn't have been, but someone else had been president who was incredibly progressive, who, or, at the other end of the spectrum, maybe you would have liked something else. But I think given what was possible at the time, could have done a lot worse.
And then, as a historian, what's a lesson that you take either from this chapter of Washington's life or the chapter of him as president?
Something that plagues Washington and so many presidents is an inability to course correct.
Sure.
And they double down and they become insulated and isolated. That's true for Washington with his cabinets that I already mentioned, with his frenemies, with all of this. And it's true for others as well. You have people like, well, not so much anymore, but, there was a lot of Grover Cleveland again kind of thing when Trump was reelected. He was before Trump, the only non-consecutive president, but his second term was an absolute disaster because the Great Panic happened and he didn't adjust. He just kept doing the same thing. And he also won on populist rhetoric and it backfired. And at the same time, his party really changed from that. And so that gives me a little bit of hope. I think that's a lesson that I've learned. Also, if you go into something and you suspect it's going to be a disaster, listen to your body, as I would say to a child. Listen to your body, and you're probably right. So I think I've taken those kinds of lessons. If you suspect that someone is being underhanded, and they probably are. And if it's not in your nature to thrive in that atmosphere, then you should probably not be in it. It's not going. If you don't adapt right away, then it's probably not for you. And I think being a general was for him. This was not. I guess as in the parlance of our time, as I can't remember which pop psychologist would say, the same one who says let them. I can't. Well, I forget what my point. I got lost in thinking about the name. But I think that basically, like, find your bliss, be true to yourself. Those kinds of things very much existed then as well. And so on a personal note, I think of that. But the Mel Robbins. Mel Robbins is her name, and so she has let them, but also, or maybe this is someone else. This is someone else. I think it's the one who's married to the soccer player. I can't remember her name either. I can see the book. It has like glitter on it. Obviously, I don't read these things. I just see them on social media. They pass me like the wind. But she said sort of, we can do hard things. And I think with Washington, that is the lesson I am constantly reminded of. And that's why I don't understand, why are you obsessing about the rippling muscles in his jaw when he did all these incredibly hard things, particularly with his body, when it was betraying him. He was very much in pain. He had so many illnesses. He almost died so many times, which seems to be the kind of president I like to write books about. And I think his perseverance for the greater good is something that I think about a lot, not to compare myself to George Washington, but so much of my labor as a historian is unpaid. And unfortunately, I don't come from generational wealth, and I'm a single mom. And so all of this is really like, it is not an easy thing to do, but I dedicate myself to this cause unapologetically, and certainly complain a lot less than him. But I think that it's something I think about a lot. It's like, well, you just have to do it. You have to work 17 hours a day. You have to not take weekends. You have to work during vacation. I was just on vacation. I did several things because it was important and I have to do it. And so I think that is, if you want a certain kind of life, if you want a certain kind of country, you have to work really hard for it. And that's a lesson that I wish people understood just by reading a book about a president rather than, or about a book about anyone who's worked hard, the arc of history kind of thing. I wrote in my Times column that, it's not a cosmic slinky. You have to really put force on it for it to bend. And the question is, like, do we do that? And I have to say that I don't think we do as much. It's a republic if you can keep it sort of thing. TBD on whether or not we can keep it. But I think that is something I really think about a lot with Washington, and that you have no idea what will age well, because the things that man tried to edit out of his work, oof, he was wrong.
I have to ask, is there an example that stands out?
Yeah, he was very proud and sort of emphasized that his lineage, that his grandfather, the first great-grandfather, like the first people to arrive on American shores, that they, as colonists, that they were known by the indigenous people as Town Destroyer. Like that was the Washington name, and so he was really chuffed when he showed up and created. He started a world war, the 7 Years' War, and if we ever talked about it, we might call it that. We might call it you know, the French and Indian War, but we never talked about it, so we don't. Um, but I think that, yeah, I think that's an example. Is he was so much of that is about, oh, they called me the town destroyer, and it was like so flattering. And then he also, in this letter where he talks about starting this world war, he doesn't talk about it until about the 7th page of the letter, and all the pages before that are like he's, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24 when he's fighting for the British. He's leading the Virginia militia, which means that anyone can come over for London and outranks him.
Huh.
They can tell him what to do. They can have no experience, and they're also going to make a lot more money than him. And Washington did not like when you messed with his money or respect or any of those things. He was fighting hard for those things in particular. So what I love is the first 7 pages are just him complaining about that. And then he's like, oh, by the way, I killed it. I didn't kill him directly, but I oversaw, so I guess it counts as me killing him. The assassination of a British or a French diplomat.
Wow.
And so, like, I think that's a something to understand. Like, live your truth, but don't be so certain of it.
This has been a super interesting conversation. Alexis, do you feel like, is there anything that we haven't talked about that we should be talking about in relation to this topic?
Hmm. I think we sort of touched upon it when the book came out in February of 2020, which was great and then awful. It had done so well, and I was still on book tour. And then I was told, oh, a few events were canceled. And this was before I had even heard of, I thought Zoom was a thing you did with a camera. And everything was canceled. Everything was canceled. And so I'm not complaining, because obviously we're still talking about it. There was a post feature on it last year. This is not something that happens to most books, that it has this staying power. And I'm very grateful for it. But at the same time, I was like, it's over. And I remember what happened a lot at first, because remember, this was like the summer of George Floyd. I was getting, and also Twitter existed still, RIP, as a place we wanted to be. And I actually enjoyed these sort of confrontations that would happen, where I would get these people on different ends of the spectrum saying, they're going to cancel George Washington, or I don't want to study him. He was an enslaver. Or they usually say he owned slaves, and I have to say, don't call it, they're enslaved because it's not a permanent state. And I say the thing about, you get to pick your heroes, but that's not why we're here. I would say, and I got that, one person tweeted at me, many, many, many people, but this was the one I remember the best. He tweeted like, I hate my family right now, and I'm going to have to move in with them. I'm going to live in a guest house, and I'm not going to speak to them. And one of the things that my mother just sent me was your book, and like, I want to throw it in the trash, because this is fundamentally what's wrong with them. And I said, why don't you try reading it? Like he described his parents as like these awful people who were conservative, all these things. Totally believed it. But I just said, I know my book, read it. It's very interesting that they sent it to you. And I kept hearing this at Mount Vernon when I was on tour, and then would make my way across. It was sort of hopscotching. And then I was in California. And so I would meet people in California whose parents had met me in Virginia and New York and, other more, other East Coast places. Boston, and then they were out there, and it was like the only thing they could talk about. And this person who tweeted at me said, "This is the only thing my parents and I talk about. We meet outside and we have a book club, and we're going very slowly. And I am so glad that I read your book because I can fight with them so much better." And I thought, that's great. Of course. You can't have a fight if you don't know what you're fighting about. You're just going to say, oh, he was an enslaver. Then they could come up with some stuff you don't even know is true and you can't correct it. And so I think that's something that I really like. That's something I really take with me as well. And I think I wish more people read. When in 2016, when Trump was elected, I wrote a piece for the Times Magazine suggesting, they have a column called Letter of Recommendation, and I suggested that everyone read presidential biographies. Not because obviously it's beneficial to me, but it's not because I think everyone will love them. I don't love most of them. I think they're dry and boring and heavy and expensive and all of these things. I'm trying to change it. But what I do think is beneficial is learning, not that they're going to tell you it was okay, but that it was never okay. It was absolutely never okay. And there's something about that which allows you to do three things that we talk about at New America, the think tank I'm at, when we talk about America's 250, which is pride in the founding. And before everyone gets mad, wait for the second thing, a reckoning for the ways we've fallen short. And then this is my favorite, which is definitely not happening right now, aspiration for a better future. And I think you can only do that if you're informed. And that doesn't mean you're a fan. Being informed and being a fan are two very different things.
So is there a lesson of informed dialogue as well?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, to my mind, the more you know, and I know quite a bit. I don't think that I'm smarter than anyone, but I do think I know more than they know, and I'm here in my, you know, my position to share that knowledge. But I think, the more I feel like the more I know I don't know. And so I don't understand people who think they know everything or know enough. I don't think that's possible. The word definitive drives me nuts. There's no such thing. You know, if I thought there was such a thing, why would I do what I do? I don't need to just speak. I'm not a history speaker. I am not an interpreter. I'm a historian. I'm finding things in the archives. I am writing new perspectives. I'm correcting too often errors of, my predecessors. And that is an incredibly humbling experience for some of us. I find it to be. So the more with a great big star going through in a nice little, reading rainbow kind of thing, it's really important.
Indeed. Well, Alexis, thank you for doing that. This has been a delightful and interesting conversation. I appreciate you bringing all this research about George Washington. I feel like speaking for myself, I know him such in a different light now. It's been very interesting to have this conversation with you. So thank you so much.
I'm so glad. Thank you for having me.